The Jewish experience focuses on taking our world and transforming it into Hashem's home. In order to achieve that, there are two different spiritual mechanisms that we need to use, and they are both reflected in the very first mitzvah the Jewish people were given while still in Egypt, which was HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem, to establish a calendar based on the lunar cycle. We're going to have a look at a debate around the nature of the witnesses who are supposed to come forward to testify that there is a new moon, and whether or not they could be related to each other, which teaches us a very powerful insight about our mission in this world. So, there's a debate between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan, which is recorded in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah, with regards to what kind of witnesses are acceptable to testify that there is a new moon. Rabbi Shimon argues that a father and son or any other immediate relative would be acceptable to testify that there's a new moon, which is unlike any other scenario. Normally we don't accept relatives as witnesses. Why is that? Pasuk, he says, because the pasuk that introduces this mitzvah says that David addressed both Moshe and Aaron together and said, this is the laws of Kiddush HaChodesh. From which Rabbi Shimon derives that Hashem is saying we can accept testimony of brothers like Moshe and Aaron to be able to establish the new moon, the new month. The Rabbanan halten, whereas the rest of the Chachamim disagree and say that just like in any other scenario, witnesses that are related to each other are automatically disqualified. And the pasuk means as lachem. So why is Hashem saying Moshe and Aaron? Because he's saying you are responsible to teach this to the future generations, that the way you establish how those witnesses are to be accepted or not is you've got to be a Moshe and Aaron, meaning as a best in is mekabel de'edus and mekadosh dem chodesh, that there has to be a reliable based in who hears the testimony about the new moon, and whether they accept that testimony or not will determine when Rosh Chodesh is. The Rebbe Marash explains the rationale that Rabbi Shimon is using as Eidos HaChodesh is anders from Kol HaEdius, why he would argue that this testimony about Rosh Chodesh is different to any other testimony, that here we accept with relatives, whereas normally we don't. Says Rebbe Marash, because Rabbi Shimon holds that we know when Rosh Chodesh is because of astronomy, even without the witnesses. As we do nowadays when we don't rely on testimony of witnesses, but rather on a when we follow the astronomical calculations to work out our calendar well in advance. So therefore these witnesses are not witnesses on which the entire reality depends. That's why you could also include people who normally are not acceptable as witnesses, direct relatives, to testify in this particular case. So, we have to ask an important question. The reason that we say normally relatives are not allowed to testify together is not because we suspect that maybe they're going to lie, but it's a decree. It's what the Eibishter decided. So if this is what the Eibishter decided, that this is how Eidos works, what's the difference if the Beis Din has the required information or not? The fact is the Torah does not accept witnesses that are related to each other. So therefore we have to explain in them. Eidos is not bir al pi seichel. When we have witnesses coming forward, it's not just a rational process. Okay, we now know that they are adult, sound-minded people who testify that this is what happened. Therefore, we can clarify what the situation is. Not is zadin, but rather it's a law in Torah, which makes something come into play, makes something come into effect. Because there is a custom. The Eibishter decided this is how you make something come into effect. You have these two witnesses, and that's why the pasuk says "Alpishne edim yakum davar," that it's on the basis of two or more witnesses that something is established. As the Rambam says, we were instructed to determine laws based on the testimony of two kosher witnesses, even though there's always the possibility that they could be lying. But the fact is, we will build a case on their testimony. So it's not just they're giving us information, they're giving the basis for a particular legal precedent. And that's why we could take this to the opposite extreme. So we're not worried maybe they're going to lie. It's a dos was craving inside impossible. This is canal, and therefore on the opposite extreme, the fact that we disqualify relatives from testifying is even if it's a situation where there's no way that they would lie. In other words, they have no vested interest, so there's no reason why they would lie in front of a beis din. Because the principle, the power of testimony is not the logic that we have people who are eyewitnesses to an event, not das take from din Torah, but rather this is something which has the power of Torah law behind it. And the Torah does not give that power to relatives. So if the purpose of Eidos is to establish something, and when it comes to testifying about the new moon, we don't need the witnesses to establish the reality. The reality is built into nature and can be objectively tested through astronomical calculations. Then, we could just rely on our calculations, which is why nowadays, when we don't wait for witnesses to come to beis din, we just simply follow the calendar. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon's perspective is, if we're bringing witnesses about the new moon, it's not because we need them, it's because they help us clarify that they've actually seen the new moon. And therefore, if we have no reason to suspect that they're going to lie, like for example, testifying about the moon, they have no personal vested interest in when Rosh Chodesh is going to be. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon says you can even accept people who are related to each other because they're actually not doing what Eidos normally does, which is to establish the whole basis of a particular legal principle. With that explanation, but we can address another question if you're looking at this halacha from Rabbi Shimon's perspective, and that is, you're telling me that we learn that relatives can testify together from the example of Moshe and Aaron. Are they classical halachic relatives? The din is, as gerim einleim kurva filshnei achim. The halacha is that if people convert to Judaism, they no longer have the halachic restrictions of relatives, even if they're brothers. And therefore can even have two brothers testify against or with each other in a court of Jewish law, because a person who converts is considered like a newborn baby. Now we could argue that when the Jewish people came out of Egypt, and certainly when they got to Matan Torah, but the Rebbe points out that even when they were leaving Egypt, because the Torah already refers to them over there as Yisrael, so they therefore considered Gerim. It's eine Moven. Was ist der Reihe von dem, was Eidos sagt, b'chem? So how does Rabbi Shimon prove that you can have relatives testify together by quoting the fact that Moshe and Aaron are addressed in this pasuk? Moshe and Aaron was having gehatat din von Gerim. So how could Moshe and Aaron, who are halachically considered Gerim and therefore don't really have true relationship to each other, how could they then be the basis for arguing that after Matan Torah, people who are not only biological but halachic siblings, that they should be able to testify? But based on the information that we've now presented, it actually makes sense. The principle that Gerim are not considered relatives and therefore can testify with each other or against each other is because it was the Torah that mandated that relatives cannot testify. Not because they have an affinity towards each other. So if the reason that witnesses cannot be related is because the Torah said so, then Gerim are no longer related. They can testify together. But our scenario, we're not relying on the Gerim in order to establish the legality of Rosh Chodesh. We know that from the astronomy. We're relying on the Eidim just to give us a clarity, intellectual clarity. So you're relying on their minds. If that's the case, is the chesaron from Kremen dem Sugedus, then the fact that they have an affinity towards each other because they're related to each other is a problem here. That could affect the way that they testify. As you can see, obviously, even if people converted, they still have that natural affinity. They think alike, like any biological sibling. Therefore, we can say, if the Torah was willing to accept Moshe and Aaron in this case, where they would probably think the same, and yet they could testify to help us clarify that it's a new moon, then it doesn't matter if it's before or after Matan Torah. The fact is the Torah is accepting this kind of eidos, even when they think along the same lines. That is Rabbi Shimon's opinion, But actually what's of greater interest to us must be the opinion of the Rabbanon, because that's the halacha, and that's obviously got a lesson for us in terms of our own spiritual development. The halacha aber bleibt wie das Rabbanon. So the halacha follows Rabbanon, as Kevin seinen Apostel, the Eides HaChodesh, that even when you're testifying about Rosh Chodesh, you cannot accept testimony from relatives. Davon ist verstandig, also ich bei Kiddush HaChodesh davon haben dem Din Eides, which implies that these witnesses coming forward, even though we have the astronomical information, are still witnesses who create a din. They actually establish the legality of the fact that it is Rosh Chodesh. Now, why would you say that if we already have the astronomy to decide when Rosh Chodesh is? Yesh levois farasim, so we'll explain. Von dem Gufo was Torah hat angesagt, dass es muss sein Eidei Re'iyah. The fact that Torah mandated that there have to be witnesses who see the moon and didn't just leave us to check how things are astronomically. And the Pasuk said clearly, well, at least the commentaries on the Pasuk say, Kozeh Re'ei V'kadesh, that you have to see the moon in a particular way and then you can sanctify the new month. Think about it logically. If either way the Beis Din has to be aware of and clear about the astronomical calculations. Not only do they have to know that information, but and we rely on that cheshbon, because that's what we're going to use to test the witnesses to see if they're telling us the truth or not. Even at the time that we need those witnesses before we can announce Rosh Chodesh. As the Rambam tells us clearly, if we know that according to the astronomy, it's not possible to see the new moon, and these witnesses come in front of us and they say they have seen the new moon, we disregard them because we're relying heavily on the astronomy. So who needs the witnesses at all? Is there von gedrungen that illustrates as Torah will Mosif sein in Inyan HaCheshbon, that the Torah wants to have two layers. It's like what we call two-step verification of this particular mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. Number one, we have the science, and then the Torah requires over and above the science that we have the mechanism of Eidos, which establishes realities. On the Fall lernen Rabbanon as Torah will zugeben. Therefore, the Rabbanon argue that Torah wants to add as the Kviss von Rosh Chodesh soll sein nicht nur al pi cheshbon, nor is bir. Was is bir? That the Torah doesn't just want us to follow science, which clarifies to our logical minds how we know that this is the time of Rosh Chodesh. Now, soll ich haben dem take von din Eidos. Torah wants to also introduce the aspect of the din of Eidos, was apishnei edim yakum davar, which establishes realities. The Torah wants us to have both. Now, that's going to raise another question, which is, well, if the Torah already mandates the witnesses, who needs the science? Another question goes the other way. If, in fact, we are determining Rosh Chodesh based on the testimony of two kosher witnesses, who have the power to establish a reality, so why then is Rosh Chodesh so radically different? Why don't we just rely on the witnesses who will be cross-examined? But we add to that a whole calculation based on science. And then we have this unusual situation where if witnesses come forward, we cross-examine them and they seem to be telling the truth, but then the science doesn't add up, we reject them. Why? So the only way to explain this is going to be according to Chassidus, because in Yedin von die zwei Inyanim there are two mechanisms over here: eyewitnesses and science. Each one brings an advantage to the table that the other one lacks. Now we're talking about establishing Rosh Chodesh, which, as we're about to discover, is not just a mitzvah. It is a foundation of what Judaism is all about. It captures the goal of the Jewish experience. Therefore, you have to have both elements involved in this process, as we'll explain. And therefore, the only way we could establish Rosh Chodesh is we have to have both components, the citing by the witnesses and the corroboration by the science. Now, in order to understand that, let's try and appreciate why would you say Rosh Chodesh is such a fundamental part of Judaism. So we'll get to that by addressing a very well-known question, which is, or at least comment, that is made about HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem, which is, that HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem is such an important principle in Judaism that by rights it should have actually been the opening conversation in the Torah. As Rashi says, it's the very first mitzvah the Jewish people were given. Therefore, it should have been the very first thing recorded in Torah, which is a book of instructions to the Jewish people. So now it's lecherem nitmuvan. We take that always as a given. This should have been the first mitzvah. But the question is why? Why, in fact, was Rosh Chodesh, or the concept of Kiddush HaChodesh, the very first mitzvah presented to the Jewish people? Surely the very first mitzvah should have been, I'm Hashem your God, through which you accept Hashem's authority, which is the bedrock of being able to be Jewish, to fulfill any of the mitzvahs. Wouldn't you have expected that to be the first mitzvah? How come Hashem chose Kiddush HaChodesh? The explanation is very interesting. Anoichi is an introduction to being Jewish, and HaChodesh HaZelochem is the foundation of being Jewish. You have to have that belief in Hashem, without which there is no foundation on which to build all of your Judaism, your observance of Torah mitzvahs. It's not possible. In order for a Jewish person to fulfill mitzvahs properly, the very first thing is that he has to accept Hashem's authority. Otherwise, what are these mitzvahs that you're doing? This mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh is not telling us what Judaism is built on, but rather is the matter of the tachlis von Torah mitzvahs, is describing what the objective and goal of all Torah mitzvahs is. Und erfahre ist das nicht boring gesagt worden bei Damazale mitzvahs als mitzvah rishona, which is why it is introduced to the Jewish people before they begin the Jewish journey, because you have to know where you're going. You have to understand what your objective is. So therefore, before we start being Jewish, we have to be told this is where you're going. How could you say that HaChodesh HaZelochem is the objective of Judaism? Because the kavanah von Torah mitzvahs is, as in Zoluftan Achidish in the Bria, the goal and objective of Judaism is that the Jewish people should innovate a new reality within creation. As we know the deeper meaning of the statement of Chazal, which is that the deeds of tzaddikim are greater than the deeds of creation of heaven and earth. Says Chassidus, why is that? Because to create heaven and earth, you had to take something that did not exist. It was in a state of absolute ayin, non-existence, even the concept didn't exist, and you had to translate it into tangible realities. Whereas the deeds of tzaddikim do the reverse. They take things that have now been created as independent entities and reduce them back to a state of ayin, complete submission to Hashem. And therefore we say their deeds are greater than the action of creation. Like the Gemara tells us with the story of Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, who davened for wealth, and the Eibishter sent him this piece of gold, and then he worked out that it was from this chair that belonged to him in Olam Haba, and he asked them to take it back. And the Gemara says the fact that they took the golden leg back is a greater miracle than the fact that the golden leg appeared in the first place. Why? Because the principle is that from heaven they give, they don't take away. The idea of taking something that already exists because the Eibishter created it, and therefore it exists in reality, that should revert to a state of ayin, that's a greater miracle, greater achievement than what the Eibishter put, so to speak, into the process. The fact that the Eibishter created from ayin to yesh is not as great as the achievement of making yesh back into ayin. So that's the chiddush, that's this great innovation of the Jewish experience. We take the physical world and we reconnect it and submit it back to absolute godliness. And that's what's alluded to in this pasuk HaChodesh HaZelochem. Chodesh is melachon chidush. That word chodesh relates to the word chidush, newness. And the koach von chidush is gegeben geworden zu Eden lochem. So right at the beginning, before we begin the Jewish journey, the Eibishter tells us, I want you to know, I've empowered you, the Jewish people, uniquely, that you have the capacity to innovate a brand new reality for creation. You and only you have the capacity to take this physical, limited, finite universe and turn it into the home for Hashem's essence. With that information, we can now understand why the Medrash identifies. When the Pasuk tells us, Shlomo Melech says, that two are better than one, the Medrash links that to Parshas HaChodesh. Why Dafka Parshas HaChodesh? And when you look at the language of the Medrash, it doesn't even seem to answer the question, because it says, Teva Parsha Shenhemro Al Pi Shnai Mi Parsha Shenhemro B'Yochid. A parsha that was said to two people, Moshe and Aaron, referring to Parshas HaChodesh, is greater than all the other parts of Torah that were only said either to Moshe or to Aaron, mostly obviously to Moshe. Bishnayim, which is the parasha that's said to two people, Shneimar Vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'Aaron be'Eretz Mitzrayim Neimar HaChodesh hazeh lochem u'v'gomer. Now, it's nicht glatt. When you think about this medrash, it's not so simple. There are actually multiple cases in the Torah where the Eibush addressed both Moshe and Aaron. It's not that unique only to HaChodesh. Is Ravos bring the Medrash Dafka deep parasha for HaChodesh Gomer? How come this is the one that the Medrash specifically identifies as Tovim Ashnayim and Echad, the two are better than one? Now, the reason for this Midrash, which will help us to understand why Moshe and Aaron are so central to this mitzvah, which is the mitzvah that sets the tone for the whole of Judaism, which will explain to us why we need to have both testimony and cheshbon in order to determine Rosh Chodesh, is as follows. HaChodesh from Rosh Chodesh is mavor de matar kolos from kol haTorah mitzvah kanal, as we've already mentioned. What's happening over here in HaChodesh is a description of the goal of all of Judaism, to create a whole new world, a whole new reality for creation. Of a Baal as a Chiddush from Torah mitzvahs is in Tzvei Nekudos Klal Yos. Now, if you had to take all of Judaism, all of Torah mitzvahs, it would fit into two general categories. One of those is Moshe's strength, the other is Aaron's strength. Is in their parasha. Therefore, this parasha, which is telling us all about the Jewish experience of changing the world, has to be associated with both Moshe and Aaron, because you need both of their components in order to achieve the objective of this chiddush of a whole new world, which is the Eibishter's home. On the far Zok the Medrash, if their parasha dafka tovim mashnayim mino echad, that's why the Medrash specifically identifies this parasha as where two are better than one, meaning two types of avodah are better than a single type of avodah. What are the unique avodas that they have to do? Well, let's start first with the objective. Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing? Many places in Chassidus and the Rebbe specifically talks about the expression that we have to make a home for Hashem in the lowest world. That this touches on two fundamental principles that have to occur in order to satisfy this requirement. There's something that has to happen to the lower world. We have to transform the lower world, that it should be a suitable place for divine revelation in the greatest sense. In other words, Hashem's home. Also, there's an impact from what's happening from on high. It has to be the Eibishter's home. That requirement is that the Eibishter's essence should be absolutely revealed in our world. Like when a person is at home, they don't have to conform to the protocols and expectations of society. They can just be themselves, with all of their being, their whole essence. Now, both sides of this coin are great surprises. In order for our lowly world to be an acceptable place to experience divine revelation, something remarkable has to happen. The physical, independent reality has to surrender itself to the Eibishter. It has to become ayin. And the fact that you can draw Hashem's essence into this reality, that is a surprise. Because our creation is all a result of a very limited glimmer of divine energy. And it's specifically when we work with the world to lose that sense of egoistic self and surrender itself to the Eibishter, that allows the opportunity to bring the Eibishter's essence into this world. That's why the Medrash identifies specifically in the context of HaChodesh that two are better than one. Because it's in this section which is spelling out for us what the ultimate objective of Torah mitzvahs is. This parasha emphasizes the two ends of the spectrum, or the two major innovations that have to happen. You have Moshe, who is the chaperone of the divine. In other words, his job is to introduce Hashem into the world. That means that Moshe empowers us to be able to draw Hashem's essence into our reality. And then, on the other hand, you have Aaron, you have Aaron who's the chaperone of the queen, referring to the Jewish people. And that represents the elevation of the world to a higher spiritual state, like Aaron's job to lift up flames. Aaron is the one who empowers us, that we could be able to take the finite physical reality and exponentially transform it and elevate it into something which is susceptible to godliness. Therefore, you need tovim ashnayim minau echad. You need both components in order to achieve this great revolution of Dira B'Tachtonim. In the same way as this mitzvah of HaChodesh describes for us the goal and purpose of the entire Jewish journey and how it impacts the world, it also captures for us the impact that Torah mitzvahs makes on us as Jewish people. The Jewish people are compared to the moon, which is considered the smaller of the two major luminaries. As the pasuk says, who could raise Yaakov because he is small. Now, the beginning of the month, which is the beginning of the new sighting of the moon and the fact that it's now going to begin to grow, the godness, that captures the idea of the Jewish people then growing and expanding from this small, limited experience to a very profound impact on the world. And the fact that the Jewish people could be elevated, there are two mechanisms for that as well. There's avodah we do with our own personalized character traits, our minds, our emotions, etc. And generally speaking, that's where we modify ourselves and grow ourselves in a very rational way. We learn, we develop because of our learning. So the value of that way of serving the Eibishter is it's very personal to us. Every growth point is meaningful to us. It's something we've invested in, so therefore it speaks to us in a very unique way. It literally integrates into our reality. It's what I understand, it's what I feel, and therefore I'm serving the Eibishter with my mind, and I'm serving the Eibishter with my emotions. So the advantage is the personal element of it. Then secondly, we have the avodah mitzad hakochos hamakifim shel neshama u'mitzad etzem neshama. Then there's the impact that happens from the more abstracted, higher dimensions of our neshama and the essence of our neshama. That primarily expresses itself in this complete surrender to the Eibishter beyond anything that is logical. That's why in order to establish Rosh Chodesh, you have to have representation of both these spiritual development mechanisms. You have to have witnesses, and you have to have a calculation to corroborate those witnesses. That will bring together these two fundamental parts of ourselves, because the goal is that there should be a chiddush of ourselves, that we should be completely different people who now are aligned with what the Torah wants. There's this concept of seeing. When you see something, it's absolutely real to you, whether you understand it or not. So the eyewitnesses are seeing the moon, whether they can appreciate what that means or not, whether they know the astronomy or not. And that represents the part of our neshama, the etzem neshama, or at least the makifim, which drive us to do what the Eibishter wants, because there's clarity, even if we cannot explain that clarity in our own terms. This was given and that's the power of testimony, where testimony creates a reality because the Torah said so, not because it necessarily makes sense. That represents our surrender to Hashem in a super rational way. And not only do we also, in addition, also use our minds to be able to understand, which is the concept of cheshbon, but we align that supernal or super rational dedication to Hashem with our cheshbon, with our way of thinking. Which means that our absolute dedication to Hashem, which is completely super rational, should be something which is very personal, that speaks to us, that integrates into our reality, by harmonizing those two aspects. Blind dedication to Hashem beyond our minds, with a deep, meaningful understanding and emotional attachment, that creates the ultimate purpose for which the world was created, which is to make our lowly reality, our mind and hearts, Hashem's home, and by that, it affects the entire world as well, and we should be zeicher to see the Dira B'Tachtonim Ben Goloi with Moshiach now.